Welcome to Texas. My name is Jay Enck. I'm with Commissioning and Green Building Solutions. I'm also chair of the 300 Standard Project Committee that's commissioning. In that organization, we have basically 12 subcommittees, 2 standards, and the rest are guidelines. My goals today are really to explain something about ASHRAE 300, as well as differentiate the differences between existing building commissioning and new building commissioning, and illustrate here are the learning objectives. And so the whole point of this is trying to get you familiar with the existing building standard, as well as what the difference between new and existing are. So this is the 300 family layout. We don't have everything in there. The primary ones are the standards, which set the minimum requirements. And then we have our guidelines for process 0 for new buildings and 0.2 for existing buildings. And then we have all the supporting documents relative to that, which are also guidelines, for HVAC, new as well as existing. Standard, or I should say, guideline 1.3, which is O&M training, 1.4, which is the systems manual. We're showing 1.6 here, which is in process for data centers, and we have ongoing commissioning, which is 1.7, which is not shown here, that is starting up currently. And then we have a lot of annexes to kind of really show how to apply the commissioning process in these different guidelines. So this slide really is some of the specifics of what's contained in 230 and establishes the roles and responsibilities in a really enforceable language. So in order to create a difference between new and existing, we had to be clear about when one would occur in the other. We also had to determine the relationship. So you do an OPR, you do a new building, it's like a new child. It's completely new, and over its lifetime, when you finish it, it's an adult, and then over its lifetime, there's multiple changes that occur to those buildings. Some are documented, some aren't. And because of that, it becomes the parent. So after you get out at the end of the new building, work and you're occupying the space, anything that changes after that is with the current facility requirements. So you're always documenting what changes need to occur as the missions within those spaces change over time. So that's the reason why we established it as a parent-child relationship, which is kind of an IT term. It's very clear, and you'll see this in some of the later slides, about what the owner's responsibilities are, as well as commissioning providers. And really, you'll just have those two entities, whereas in new construction, you've got a design and construction team that you're dealing with and are part of your team as far as delivering that building. But in the existing building, you only have usually the O&M staff or the O&M contractor that's there. So a lot of existing building is really doing investigative work. And you're getting in to find out what the problems are. You're then coming up with recommendations to the owner. You've got the O&M staff that's got to come and do the modifications or the repairs. And it's primarily repairs that we see. A lot of, as you're going along, you'll do calibration and those kinds of things. If you have energy efficiency recommendations, if it's within their budgets, they're going to go ahead and implement those. But it really depends on how much money they have and what they can afford to do from that perspective. If you have, and you can have within the existing building commissioning process, you can have new construction activities that occur. And you can implement those at any time within that process, but it's unlikely that they will occur because most of those require capital funds in order to accomplish, because they got a design and construction team they have to hire. So this is some verbiage out of 230. It basically says this is what the owner's responsibilities are. In really, this is starting in the utilization portion of it, and that you're going to come along and have a team that can be able to do the work. But it also indicates what each individual's deliverables are relative to the existing building commissioning process. And because it's in code language, it can be enforced as you would a building code, which can be adopted by international building code if they so desire. But the owner's got to be able to get you a lot of information. And one of the problems that we're seeing with existing buildings is a lot of that information is lost. And so you have to come back and be able to help them often reestablish that. You have to do investigations to figure out where the ductwork goes, is it installed correctly? How is it, you look at the discharge coming off an air handler, you got 2 inches of static loss right at the air handler. I mean, those are all problems that are energy related that are really costing more money as well as creating more climate change. So that's how 230 is structured, is to define those variables. So, as I said, this is a 2013-2014 project. It's 310,000 square feet, built in 57. It had undergone more than 40 documented renovations in that time, and many more that were undocumented. And you'll see as we present the information that came out of that, where some of those problems exist and why there's difficulty in trying to get existing building commissioning as far as information. So the process for existing buildings is broken into 5 phases. You have the planning phase, which is really getting in and getting information from the owner, because in your assessment phase, you're going to end up using that information to be able to plan how you're going to commission the building. And then the implementation phase is you've identified this is what needs to be done, and they come in and do it for what they can as far as their budgets go and their capabilities, or get some outside sources. And then you have the handoff that occurs. So when you get to handoff, in this case, there was a lot of things left over that still needed to be done that they didn't have budget to do, that I'll give you a little bit more information on. So this was the owner's scope of work. Being NASA, they were pretty clear about what their objectives are. We had pneumatic controls in a lot of it. We had, had some areas that had DDC. They wanted to improve occupant satisfaction and comfort. They wanted to be able to reduce energy consumption. And they wanted to be able to implement low and no cost. And they thought, well, we've had this O&M contractor and he's been on board all this time. And so we don't think there's going to be a lot of repairs, but we've we're going to have money for repairs and maybe modifications to improve. So they also identified that they were having indoor air quality issues. So during the development of the current facility requirements, and because this is this building has, I don't remember the number of labs, but it has a lot of labs in it. And each one of those labs is for doing space projects, where you're launching missiles and landing on the moon or Mars. In this case, this facility was dedicated to the Mars missions. Over the years, we've had a lot of the changes that occurred in that building where they had labs that got moved, different criteria depending on what program they were working on. So we had to really, besides figuring that stuff out, in order to be able to determine how well you did in the building commissioning process, the existing building commissioning process, you had to establish baselines. So during the CFR, we established which baselines we were going to utilize. And we also had where they needed to have the systems kind of brought back up into where they were operating correctly, because they had a lot of complaints, and they wanted to improve comfort as well as performance and reliability. So as I've indicated, during that planning phase, you're collecting this information. Doing the workshop for the current facility requirements is really necessary. And the people who developed the scope of work weren't necessarily the same people that were living in the building and having to deal with all the issues. So getting those together, and we used the nominal group technique to be able to gather that information from them. And for the labs, because they each had different criteria, we put together worksheets for them to tell us what the equipment they had, the number of people that they had in the space, in order to be able to do load calculations, because part of what we were tasked with is developing, what's that amount of air that should be delivering into these spaces, how to make those spaces more comfortable, how to be able to meet the requirements that they have relative to their research. And in many cases they had, and this is, you can see the picture, or no, that's the next slide, but you can see how spread out this project is. A lot of wings, and there has been a lot of issues with that over the years, mostly because of a lack of maintenance, is what we found. So we benchmark energy utilities, electricity, steam, chilled water. We also took as a benchmark the work orders and the trouble calls. We tracked all of those to set baselines, as well as part of 230 requires a occupant survey. So that gets information from the regular occupants that aren't necessarily involved with the key management and the principal investigators who come and participate in the current facility requirements. So they really were looking for changes in the HVAC operations. They really needed to be able to tighten up and stabilize controls and temperatures, because if they couldn't keep them, then their research in seeing whether or not what they were designing for was actually going to perform. So they had very strict criteria, and they often had crack units in addition to the primary VAV systems that were serving them. So then you're trying to get those to work together, and so that was part of the complications. They also wanted to have alarms so they knew when the criteria for the indoor conditions was not being met so they could do something about it. And then they did have issues with some of the lighting was part of that. And they wanted to make sure that the systems got rebalanced based upon the current loads. The O&M team and the commissioning team worked together. Part of what they wanted to have from the workshop was they wanted service manuals. Well, we tried to go back to the manufacturer and get these service manuals, but because the equipment was so old, it wasn't available. They had some submittals, but it was just cover pages. It wasn't actually any data to them, which, is very common in existing buildings that, they got something, but they don't really have the stuff that you need to be able to determine the performance of those pieces of equipment. They also wanted a easy-to-access format for that information. And so as we were going through this process, we were using, basically using PDF and links to organize that so that it was important that they were able to get access to it. And then they wanted to make sure that the building systems interaction was working in harmony relative to that. They wanted single-line electrical drawings, which the owner did not add to our scope, because that would have been a lot more time to trace down all the circuits. But then they wanted the tab and commissioning reports as well. So really and kind of going back, that's kind of a summary of the stuff. You go back and what is it that you as a provider need to deliver as part of the planning phase? It's really just having an outline of a table of contents of a systems manual so they know where to file the stuff, and you give them a format for doing it. And then you go ahead and give them an occupant survey to distribute. But your real deliverable is getting a current facility requirements approved. And then you've got to work through, the next phase is really working through schedules. So you need to get that information part of, when can I be at your lab? When do you don't want anybody there? When do we have access to the electrical and mechanical rooms, so that you can, during your assessment phase, start putting together a plan of how you're going to execute. So really the assessment phase, there's kind of an initial part of that, because when you get to where you've analyzed the floor plans, you've made a plan, you've figured out how you're going to execute your commissioning process with them, and you've gotten their blessing on it, then that goes into your plan, into your existing building commissioning plan, because that then helps communicate with all the parties, what you're doing, when you're going to do it, and what their availability is and when they don't want you there. But throughout the process, you're going to be identifying things that need to be analyzed. So you always really have analysis all the way through, and even after implementation when you're putting together your final results. So that's kind of how that all goes. So as part of the scope of work, we did the calculations. We determined the loads. We did preliminary, or first we had TAB go out and do actual readings and figure out what they were getting as far as outside air, what was being delivered in total on the units as far as the air handler goes. We didn't get them into the spaces yet until after we got through with the load calculations and that. But at least to understand, were the units able to deliver in comparing against the existing documents? Could we get there with what they had changed the building to be over that period of time to be able to meet the requirements for the internal conditions that needed to be attained by the particular labs and offices. So getting at that initial assessment phase, as you're starting your investigation, really did set the foundation for going forward from analyzing that information. So part of the effort, as we said, is doing the baselining. So what we did is we took 3 years worth of data on steam, electrical, as well as chilled water. There's a central plant, so everything was coming from the central plant for steam and chilled water. And then we looked at how those energy consumption was, but then we normalized it using weather data. So you can have, you don't have 2 years ever the same as far as energy consumption. So until you normalize that data, you're not going to compare apples to apples. So basically that's what is in these charts. And if you can also use these charts and when you start to overlay them, chill water and steam, you can start seeing where things have happened in the building that you're able to see where you have simultaneous heating and cooling and those kinds of things. But that's, you can determine your base loads, your process loads. You can see where your lighting comes into it. So those are all aspects of it. In this particular slide, we're developing that initial energy usage intensity. So what we saw in the data is that they had a decrease in chill water by 14% over this 2-year period. And part of this was because they had implemented strategies on the central plant side to be able to optimize that performance on the chill water side. But we also saw that steam consumption had increased and then decreased significantly in that the electrical went up by 53% during this time period. Well, what we discovered is that they had a hot water loop that was fed by steam that had to be shut down because it was it had so much leakage in it they couldn't control it. And so as a result, the increase in electrical was probably related to unit heaters coming in because people were cold in those portions of the building. So that kind of gives you an idea of the condition of this building was in. So here are the work orders. I mean, this is just for the 3 years leading up to when we started the existing commissioning building process. And we used those to determine, what the average trouble calls were, what kind of maintenance activities they had, and how much they were spending in expenditures, so that you have some sort of benchmark to compare your post existing building commissioning process against. So the occupant survey came back, and you can see they didn't quite meet ASHRAE 55 with 80% satisfaction. They're down in the 30% range. Most people are unhappy. So that was a sign that things need to be taken care of. Slab on grade, 53 or 1957 windows. There's radiant effects from that. People get cold adjacencies to that. Slab on grade, your feet get cold. Those kinds of things. In an existing building, there's not much you're going to do about that. Maybe put in a little bit better carpet and insulation on the floor, or change the windows out. But that's changing windows out and redoing the building enclosure is an expensive proposition. We didn't have the money that ASHRAE had in the headquarters. Anyhow, So the occupants, they complained about fluctuating temperatures throughout the day, different parts of the building not, being hot and cold in comparison, stuffiness. There was a lot of hot and cold calls. There was, a lot of inconsistencies as far as what conditions were being sensed in the different areas. And there were indoor air quality problems. So some of those indoor air quality problems were related to fresh air intake locations. We also used CO2 monitoring as we went through in our investigation to determine the kind of concentrations that we had, because you can evaluate the amount of outside air you're getting with the number of population you have in there and the CO2 levels that you get from that. If you're very close to outside, you're getting a lot of ventilation. The indoor air quality control, or I should say indoor air quality results on the survey, they had complaints from the outdoor sources, but most of it was coming from the carpets, the old carpets. And we didn't get a date when they were last installed, but they looked pretty worn. But they also had problems with cleaning products that were being used. Now, Well and LEED have good guidance on if you want to do a more sustainable and not have any strong chemicals being used in the building that affect people. They have some guidelines for that. So this is from the lighting survey. Most people were happy with the lighting, although we also had received a number of inputs on the survey that they were suffering from too much glare. One of the things that they did, trying to save energy, the original lighting was fluorescent T12. So they came in, and it was 4-lamp T12. So they came in and put T8s in 4 lamps. Electrical contractor comes in and does it. The amount of lumen output was significantly higher. It then started to affect their ability to read their screens because it was so intense and causing a lot of glare. They would have saved a lot more energy had they actually included somebody like a lighting specialist, because they probably could have gotten away, instead of having 4 lamps, they probably could have gotten away with 2 lamps because of the increased efficiency of the T8s that they had put in. But that was causing some angst about the comfort level of the lighting for them. They also had a lot of flicker, and so there might have been some areas of the building that had still the old T8s in them. Because they did indicate that they had some areas where they had insufficient lighting. They said that the hallways were commonly too dim, the conference rooms were often too dim. They didn't have any lighting controls, so if, PowerPoint presentations or something like that, they were having the board that they were presenting on basically whited out by the lighting. They were having issues with the bathroom lighting and being too dim, especially in the stalls. So certainly getting all that information and continually analyzing it, we were able to establish, what the tab scope of work was, having taken the readings from before any modifications. We had come up with what the outside air volumes should be. We had a number of air handlers that were either locked 100% open or locked 100% closed, so that made a difference in the areas that was being served and the kind of complaints you were getting and where they were coming from relative to that. But that information really provided a starting point for how we were going to conduct our investigation. So our investigation effort really was going through and first looking at it from a pre-functional perspective. Do the dampers work? Do the variable vane controls, the variable volume vane controls on the fans, what was actually working from that air handling unit? So that was really the first thing as far as repairs go, is to get them to come in and fix the stuff that needed to be done. What we discovered, as we got into it, we went over to talk to the controls, because they have a resident O&M contractor and they have a resident controls contractor. Well, the controls contractor told us that, well, we're replacing all of these pneumatics in the next 6 months. So we go, well, it doesn't make any sense to spend money to commission the pneumatics when you're going to replace them in 6 months. So then we had to go back and redo the schedule and extend the length of the contract that we were going to be there in order to facilitate that, because it didn't make any sense to do it twice or lose the value and have that come in and not have it commissioned. So there was extensive testing that went on throughout, not just from that look at did the parts and pieces of the system actually operate, but also going through and checking what the sequences were that they had. Since they were putting in DDC, we were able to develop sequences that would be more appropriate for a DDC system and provide better performance if they implemented it. So that's the kind of things that we worked out during that process. But we had a lot of issues. I mean, a lot of the fixes had to do with really minor stuff like insulation. Well, if you don't have your chill water lines insulated, they're going to sweat. We had a number of valves that didn't operate. They were just frozen in place. So that was a lot of stuff that needed to be done just to be able to service it and be able to maintain it. So that we went through that, and they got those taken care of, which is burning this budget really quickly from what they had allowed, which they didn't think was going to be much more than minor modifications. And then we made recommendations, to NASA about what needed to be done as far as that, and we got weekly reports to the O&M contractor and stuff that we needed to the controls contractor, and then they would tell us what they had taken care of. We'd go back and see if the testing, and anytime you go through a repair process, you didn't probably able to test the whole thing. You had to go back and retest it again to see that they actually stroke correctly and those kinds of things, which is normal in the commissioning process. So we're really going through and also identifying the condition of the systems and what they needed to, as far as a kind of a replacement, how much useful service life is left as part of that. We had determined what the airflow and water flow requirements were from a chill water and a heating hot water, as well as the supply air. We then also ended up going above ceilings, documenting, they still had ducts disconnected from the diffusers and that kind of stuff that we found. They did, we had to do the layouts, make those single line drawings to be able to so that they knew what they had, because they didn't have an idea of what went where because of all the changes that occurred over the time. I already talked about the fact that we figured out that they were changing out the DDC. We also did pressure mapping to make sure that the labs were being controlled the way they needed to relative to that, and that the building was staying positive from that perspective. We had documented over 875 operational issues during that 1-year period that we did that. So widespread issues, restroom exhaust fans were not interlocked. You know, they would be running 24 hours a day. You know, the units were shutting down in some cases, and this facility is in Huntsville, Alabama, which is humid. So you have periods of time when you don't really want to negatively pressurize your building. They had economizers that weren't working, which is nothing new in going back on economizers. We talked about the missing insulation. You know, the other thing was happening is the internal lining of the insulation, the fiberglass insulation, it was all coming apart. We were finding fiberglass particulate on desks and those kinds of things. And there was also a lot of moisture carryover because of the velocities that they were using. And so, you know, you get a little bit of dirt, you get some moisture there, you got mold and mildew going crazy on you. So those were the kinds of things that we found. We found that, you know, VFDs where they had them were bypassed or in hand, and that, you know, we found some that the fans were dangerously close to becoming dislodged. So it was we were really surprised at the shape the building was in from that perspective. So that's more of what we've just talked about relative to that. You know, we've already talked about the crack units, and you know, we found exhaust fans that hadn't been wired up. We found exhaust fans that were part of another lab that were running that didn't have the same lab in there. You know, so it was just a real mishmash of modifications that occurred over the years without a whole lot of thought. And then the excessive pressure drops, which I talked about originally. So these are just some, you know, we got a lot of these, and there's not a bunch. I mean, this is just everyday stuff where we have both heating and hot water going through the coils at the same time, and where we had, you know, broken linkages and, you know, variable pitch blades that need to be, you know, which has been mentioned before. You know, issues with fans and fan motors, you know, relief dampers failing to operate. You know, humidifier drainage sloping the wrong direction. Just really, nobody was paying attention. Again, you know, just same kind of stuff that we've been talking about there. We already talked about the insulation pieces showing up on the desks and that, and the mold and mildew. You know, prior to performing a lot of the tests, we did, as we were going through, did calibration of everything we were coming in contact with, so that when we got to actually doing testing, that we could rely on that information. And then doing the full functional performance testing, but then also coming back and doing trend reviews under actual conditions to make sure that they were performing the way they were supposed to with the actual conditions that were occurring, and that they were keeping the laboratories within the tolerances that the research people needed to have. Now, not everything got fixed. So this is just a summary of the things that we did, which I've already pretty much talked about, relative to the changes that occurred from a tab perspective, from a controls perspective, and from the air handling perspective. We did go, when we calculated the ventilation requirements, we used ASHRAE 62-2010 as the basis for that. Just in summary, you really have you really are limited to what you've got, the best you can repair it, and the best you can tune it for what's there. And that's kind of the limitations that you have on existing buildings. A lot of times the owners don't really have the money to go and replace things unless they have that information well in advance, which requires the capital planning. We kept a resolution and issues log. The tab services went well as far as the getting the test and balance done after we got a second contractor. The controls contractor was, working to complete his stuff by 2014. So, in addition to the numerous upgrades made during the time of the existing commissioning activities, which was basically right around 2013 into the start of 2014. There was a lot of things that were repaired and taken care of from that perspective, and that we were then going to base our results on what the next year brought as far as reductions in work orders, energy consumption, and occupant satisfaction. So at the handoff, we didn't get everything done, but the contract ends. Here's the list, guys. This is what you need to do. I'm sorry if you want to come up with more budget or more time, we'll be happy to sit here and do that. So the results was really we had the kilowatt consumption went down 11%. Steam consumption went down 19%. Chilled water went down by 8%. So the heating degree days actually went up by 24% from what the baseline was. The trouble calls went down by 43% as a result. And the utility savings on the utilities as well as the work orders was over a $90,000 savings. So we recalculated the EUI. We came in, a good 20,000 kilobTUs per square foot. That's not bad, considering that we still had a lot of stuff that needed to be fixed. And then we had a lot of, this is the reduction in the areas of reduction that we had, from a chart format. We did say it was 43%. You can see how that got arrived. And then from an occupant survey, we increased satisfaction by 13%. Maybe if we could get the rest of the building fixed, it would have changed it up and been much more palatable to the occupants. Still no heating in part of the C wing, and we still had 473 open issues out of the 875. So this is a summary of the process, but also the challenges, which is what I try to provide in this relative to existing building commissioning. Questions? Steve?
I got a bunch of them, but I'm not going to.
There is a mic. Let me get you a mic.
I can speak loudly.
Okay, go ahead.
So, scope creep and something like this is insane. So, how was the contract structured to do an investigation assessment, try and identify available documentation, existing conditions? Is that like one project, one scope, and then you come back and do the modifications and testing and documentation thereafter, or was it just all open? You've got X amount of dollars, X amount of time, and that's what you hand them and you walk away. I'm just thinking scope creep's just going to be insane.
You know, the government likes to have a fixed firm price.
Yeah.
So it was all in one.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had to manage within that budget what we could do within that.
Mm-hmm. Ah.
Anybody else? You got one in the back.
Did you do like 100% testing on the terminal units, or did you do the sampling?
Everything we went through, we did 100% on. You know, in an existing building, if you've got the DDC system, you could do it through the DDC system and look at their operations, record that, see how things are changing. But if you don't have that in place, you can't do that. And because it was new installations, we still wanted to make sure that we got the stroking and everything that need to occur as far as control, which you can still see in the trends if you look if they give you the damper position and that kind of information. So it was a combination of each. 10 minutes.
Jay, the thing I'm curious about is how did you manage time frames for collecting information from the owner, having the owner do repairs? Because I could see that being one of those things that, could stretch way on beyond the contract. So how did you manage, collecting that information and getting that, getting the owner to uphold their end of the bargain?
Well, that was the difficult part. They had set aside $1.4 million for repairs. Halfway through, they ran out of money. So they basically, NASA said, you have from this date to this date, you perform what you can within that date. You give the information to the O&M contractor. He's going to do what he can. You're going to leave us a list of what needs to be done when you run out of time. And it was not an easy job.
So you had 875 open issues, and you finished at 540.
No, 475, I think, yeah. I did have a wrong number previously.
How do you prioritize, fixed sum of money, so much of resources left? How do you prioritize which issues you're going to go after? Did you use the owner's requirement? What was your guidance in determining what you could go after and do versus what you just leave?
Well, how we were doing it was we were giving what that list was. The O&M contractor was coming back and saying, I'm willing to do this, I'm not willing to do that. The owner he really stayed out of it. They were just wanting the results. And, it's funny in government, they often won't cross over lines of authority. So they don't want to piss off the O&M contractor, so they're not in there saying, well, you need to fix this before you fix that. And they didn't really ask for any input relative to that. It was all up to the O&M contractor. So it wasn't the best thing in the world. We really should have had some idea of prioritization, but a lot of it was just getting the equipment to run. And getting the dampers to work and those kinds of things. Us going through and doing the test and balance really made a big difference because they had a lot of excess outside air that they were doing. And they, the interlocks, I don't think they got put in, what they needed to do. The sequences got changed. I think we would have had a much better result had we gotten through and actually gotten that stuff done. But, it's an existing building. You're working with these different government entities, and it's kind of, well, this is what I'll do and this is what I won't do. It's almost like working with the union. Jim.
We call it the M word, Jay. When you report, active biological growth, there's certain chain of custody and liability issues for both you and your client.
Yeah.
And how was that handled?
We reported it to them. We didn't do any analysis. I mean, we certainly do mold and mildew kind of work and forensic investigations, but the best we could do, Jim, is let them know and tell them the part of the reason behind what was causing it. A lot of it was the moisture carryover in the units because of the velocities. And we tried to get that taken care of as best we could under test and balance, but they didn't go in and replace that insulation. They didn't go in and do any remediation of it. So the liability lies with them as you make them aware of it. Now it's their turn to take action.
Is it something you would recommend excluding from your contract explicitly?
Say that again?
Mitigation of...
Yeah, we didn't have any. Yeah, it was clear that we were not responsible for those kinds of things. We were there strictly to identify and improve, and it was the O&M contractor's responsibility to take care of it.
So like test and balance company and any other company that you have to work with, would that fall under your contract or?
Yeah, they work for us.
So you get pricing from them before you?
Yeah, we did. We did have an unfortunate circumstance that the first tab contractor that we hired, I think there was drugs involved or something, but when we went to verify, their results of tab, they were nowhere near. I mean, it was, so we had to battle and give reasons why and show reports of how we would need to get rid of them, which we did. And then we brought in another tab contractor who did a very good job and helped us out. And he helped significantly because, we had locked into a number. And so that was a painful thing for us.
And does that also include hiring a controls contractor? Or?
No, the controls contractor was a resident controls contractor that ran their central front end and managed all the controls on base. So that was easier. Oh, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I have a couple of questions, actually.
Sure.
One of them is, for the implementation phase, what was NASA's ROI? In other words, what did they want to see in terms of low-hanging fruit? What did they want you to implement? Did they have like a
Anything under 2
3-year
years.
turnaround?
And so we did make recommendations that would require capital improvements and funding that met that criteria. So part of the CFR is developing, what is that criteria of the owner to make those investments? And that was included, and that was part of the report, but they didn't implement those while we were there.
Yeah, I noticed that you had about a 40% out of your 875 issues that you found, and you were able to fix 361, which is about 40%.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, they said, that's it, we're not fixing anymore, that's too much money.
Well, that's what the controls contract, I mean, not the controls, but that's what the O&M contractor said. I'm out of budget, and
Right.
they didn't force anything upon them to change it because they negotiate those on a regular basis, and there's language in there about if things cost over a certain amount, you're going to reimburse me. So it's negotiation back and forth. It's not something that happens quickly. Wade?
Was the O&M contractor, was it under you, or was it the actual facility's O&M contractor that had been taking care of the facility the entire time?
It was the O&M contractor who was taking care of the facility the whole time, and he was not happy with what we were finding. And that being said to the owner, you know how that went down.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I was told that the heating degree days has been increased 24%. I wonder if that has been compared to the baseline or compared to the original design.
We didn't go back and compare against the original design. We took what the existing condition was, 3 years worth of data beforehand, and then what the data was after we did the work.
Okay, I can guess that the outside air damper is 100% closed. If it is open, I can guess that it can increase the heating degree days. Is there any other reason do you think that heating degree day increased 24%, which is significant?
Well, we went through and got that stuff repaired, and we found that in general, the building was being over-ventilated. We had some that were closed, but majority of them were over-ventilated.
But if you decrease the ventilation, then it'll decrease the heating degree days,
We didn't
isn't it?
increase it. Because of the calculations, we were able to reduce the amount of outside air that was being brought in. It was over-ventilated. So coming back and rebalancing, we met the ASHRAE requirements of 62 relative to that. These are VAV systems, so you have specific criteria relative to VAV systems, the amount of outside air required for those, you know, because it got to get the air distributed. And that's what set that criteria. So we reduced outside air volumes.
Yeah, my confusion comes from if you decrease the ventilation, then I guess the heating degree day will decrease together instead of increasing. But I think I saw that heating degree day increased 24% instead of decreasing.
Yeah, I'm just telling you what the results were. The heating degrees days went up by 24%, and we had that much reduction. Okay, we could sidebar, or she says one more question.
For the pneumatic control to DVC, or change to DVC, any challenges or lessons learned after that?
Well, since they were changing out the boxes totally, not really. I mean, I'm glad we didn't have to go through the pneumatics. You know how stressful those are, and trying to get them to work the way you can for doing tab. Thank you, everyone, for your time.